My name is Pat Auspos, and on behalf of Roundtable on Community Change, I'd like to thank you all for being here. It's really because of the expertise and experience of people like you that we could write a book like Voices 3, because it is the collective wisdom of the field that we tried to capture. So, and some of you who are here are actually contributors to the book. So thank you again. What I'm going to do now is just quickly run over what the evening will consist of. First, Ann Kubisch will give a little talk on the findings of Voices 3. She'll talk for about 20 minutes, and then we will have a panel discussion moderated by Tom Dewar, and our distinguished panelists are Joel Ratner, Jennifer Vanica, Raphael Bostic, Elena Harkness, John Barros, and Xavier Briggs. After that, we will have some questions from the audience, so for about 10, 15 minutes. So that's it. Ann?
Very good. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. Diana, you just got here too. Thanks. So what I'm going to do is talk for about 20 minutes. We are assuming that you all haven't had a chance to read this book, but that it's on your bedside table and you'll be reading it over the course of the next few days and weeks. But we thought that we'd just lay out for you what some of the main themes are that are in the book that can lay the groundwork for the panel discussion and for the discussion with you for the rest of the evening. So what this is this is a third in a series called Voices from the Field, where we tried to take a look at various types of community change efforts. They used to be called comprehensive community initiatives, sometimes called community building initiatives, but that are place-based and are trying to improve outcomes for kids and families and make conditions in neighborhoods better. What we did is we ended up drawing our information from 48 of them, and there's a list of them in the back of the book. And we did a combination of reviewing program documents and evaluations, but because we find that so much of the knowledge and wisdom about community change efforts is really in people's heads, we did a lot of interviewing and a lot of small group discussions. And so this is a combination of that effort. When we looked at these, we looked at ones that have been in existence that started in the late 80s and early 90s all the way up through the contemporary time. A rough back of the envelope calculation says that there's probably been about $1 billion of philanthropic investment in these works. And depending on how you count the public sector money, it's around $10 billion. If you add in Hope 6, it really starts to get up there. Just on Hope 6, sometimes we refer to Hope 6 and sometimes we don't, because it's place-based, but it doesn't quite have a community building orientation, so we tried to pull some lessons from there, but it's not really a focus of this. So what I want to talk about, first of all, is what we can say in general about what they accomplished. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about some of the broad lessons that we feel like we can draw from it, and just give you a flavor for some of the challenges for the field going forward. And I'll figure out how to go forward. So what have they done? In terms of producing tangible, documentable outcomes, they can show improved outcomes for individuals in the neighborhoods. But I want to say something very important about that. It's improved outcomes for the individuals who participated in the programs in the target neighborhoods. And this is going to be a theme that we'll come back to. So that, for example, the Harlem Children's Zone, you all were at the Harlem Children's Zone Promised Neighborhoods Initiative yesterday. They can show improved test scores for kids in 3rd and 8th grade in their charter school. That's very important. Second, a lot of them built housing. John Barros, how many units of housing have you built and rehabbed?
On our land trust, 210. Outside of our land trust, about 800.
Yeah, okay. So built housing, and particularly those that were based in CDCs, can show housing that was built, and some of them can show associated outcomes like reductions in crime and increases in property values as a result of that work. And then a third thing that you can point to is that many of them developed commercial space. And you'll be hearing from Jennifer, I'm sure, over the course of the evening. There's a lot of very interesting stuff that's going on in San Diego, and what they've done in terms of commercial space is really impressive. Then there was also a set of outcomes that have to do with community building. And so there's many sort of there's qualitative evidence and lots of powerful anecdotes about how new leadership was developed in the context of these initiatives. Leaders who have been in their neighborhoods for a long time, like John. Leaders who have moved from their neighborhood level work to positions in foundations and technical assistance organizations and research organizations, in public policy positions, OMB, HUD. We even take credit for the mayor of Savannah in this field. So then new social capital, meaning new connections among people. There are powerful stories about those kinds of connections. Organizational capacities were increased. And then something that we've called community civic capacity, which really means the community's capacity to represent itself to powerful outside forces, to the public sector, to the private sector, through by doing organized community planning, by community organizing, by being able to represent and speak for the community to outside power bases. Then another one of the objectives of these initiatives over the course of the last 20 years has been about policy and systems change. And this part of it is a little bit sobering, because I think we expected to see more than we actually saw, but I want to tell you if you ask people who are in the community change initiatives what they say that they can document as policy and system change, they will often talk about how they attracted and leveraged new funding in the neighborhood, and some of them document it very carefully. I know that in the MacArthur-Lisk initiative, they're really documenting that very carefully in the evaluation that MDRC is doing. In terms of system responsiveness, I want to make a point about the difference between transactional system responsiveness versus transformational system change. That there are examples of when the community groups needed the system, the public sector system, to do something differently, and they were able to access and get a regulation changed, getting a rule changed, getting people to pay attention. That was not transformative of the system, but they were able to get things done on their behalf. And then finally, I think one of the themes that several people talk about, and that we see thanks to the presence of Xav and Raphael here, is that we see sort of a new legitimization of place-based work. That we see it in the current policy administration. In the current administration, we see it in foundation work. We see it in state and local government work. So that's what they have done. Here's what they didn't do. They did not transform neighborhoods. And it's important to say this, because if you read the documentation that accompanies a lot of this work, they talk in very lofty terms, like we are going to transform neighborhoods. We are going to turn around this neighborhood. We're going to make it a healthy place for kids and families. They have not done that yet. So we don't see, for example, population level changes in these neighborhoods. We see improved outcomes for individuals who participated in the services that were put into place in those neighborhoods. But do we see aggregate changes in poverty levels as a result of these initiatives? No, we don't see that yet. Were they the target? Were they the engines for major economic development? They did commercial revitalization. They did build housing, but they were not the engines for economic development in the poorest communities. And as I said, they did not trigger the kind of system reform that everybody had hoped. So the bottom line is that the community change efforts of the last 20 years have not transformed poor communities. The good news is that they've improved outcomes for individuals and communities, and they've built capacity. The community building dimension of it is noticeable and is something that people report on. So what does that mean for the future? The future is we can't do poverty reduction work without paying attention to place. We can't do it without place-based work. We talk a lot about regionalism now. It's very important, but we still are talking about regionalism as it connects to poor communities. And so therefore, we have to take the lessons that we've learned from doing this and apply it to the next generation of work, because we don't have a choice. We have to do this work. So now let me talk about some of the lessons that I think are sort of the highlights of what we've learned and that are in the book. The first thing I want to say has to do with being clear about what can and can't be done through place-based community change efforts. We have to get clarity about the outcomes that we expect and the theory of change that goes along with it. And the reason that's an important statement to make is that we now, in retrospect, realize that too many of them overpromised. They promised that they could do too much in too short a period of time with too little money. And when they don't do it, it makes it seem like this is a failure, a failed strategy, when in fact what we really need is some honest discussion about what can and can't be done through place-based work, what kinds of alliances they need to build, have realistic assumptions about the outcomes, the timeframes, the levels of investment, and so on. And make sure that we're making distinctions between putting several good programs into place in a particular neighborhood versus an initiative that is externally sponsored by, say, a government or by a foundation with a start and end time and a fixed amount of money, versus what is community change, which is long-term changes in the community conditions. That is just an example of of a need for clarity, because we confuse all of those things all the time. In particular, we confuse a lot about the role and value of the community building dimensions of the work. Now, the community building dimensions, as I said earlier, is leadership development, social capital development, organizational capacity building, community civic engagement, and community civic capacity. That is defined so differently across this field. And so what is one initiative or one organization's deep community engagement is another location's occasional community consultation for some buy-in. And that's a big range, and it is unresolved so far in this field because we are willing to just use terms like community building and say, oh, we know what that means. And the thing is that it means, we also need to be clear about it because it might mean different things for different kinds of outcomes. If you want employment outcomes, for example, building social connections within the neighborhood may not be the right thing. It's about building connections between the worker and the employer who might be outside the neighborhood. Whereas if you want neighborhood safety, as Robert Sampson has told us, you do need to have some kind of social connections within the neighborhood. Or if you want to increase civic capacity, that's more an internal social capital connections kind of work. And the final reason why this is very important is because the beginning of a discussion about working in very poor neighborhoods might start, say, at a foundation board saying, we know that this is a very disinvested neighborhood. We know that the capacity is low. We know that there's no power in this community. And so we understand that we must make, first of all, a long-term commitment, and we must make a commitment to capacity building and community building. And that's going to be the first step. And then that goes on for year 1, and then year 2, and then year 3, and then by about year 4, they start to say, yeah, but what's all this community building doing? Where's the outcomes? Where's the beef? And so what ends up happening is these investments in community building get judged prematurely or by the wrong thing, by whether they've produced hard outcomes. Now, we want them to, we do believe that community building and producing hard outcomes are connected, but we have to be clear about the theory, the interim outcomes, how long it takes, and so on. All right, the third lesson is because these community systems are so complex, and because the causes of the problems are so complex, we have offered as solutions comprehensiveness. And comprehensiveness is the solution to the interaction effects of the complexity. And what we've found is that comprehensiveness is very hard to implement. It's very hard to implement because sometimes it's overwhelming and you can drown under the weight of a comprehensive strategy if you have to do everything. Or what is more common is things get diffused. A little bit of education here, a little bit of housing there, a little bit of neighborhood safety here, and then you don't get to the dose and the scale that you need to produce the outcomes for the individuals in the neighborhoods that are the targets for this. So we need to figure out how to balance an appreciation for complexity and comprehensiveness with the intentionality that's required to produce the outcomes. And that's a balancing act that we have to be comfortable with and we have to get better at. And what that means and what we talk about, and I'm hoping that maybe as the evening goes on, Jennifer will help us think about this too. We use the term internal alignment because it's being very clear about what outcomes you're trying to achieve, what management structures you have to have in place, what programs you're going to put into place, and have accountability structures in that. And that is a hard thing to do in a multifaceted effort at the community level. It's even harder to do because the kind of change that we're talking about requires lots of actors. There are very few institutions that are on their own able to do this work by themselves. So what we're talking about is getting multiple stakeholders. Oops, sorry about that. I'm going to get better at this. By the end of this, I'll have this down. We're talking about, hold on one second. A lot of stakeholders who have a lot of roles, and what ends up happening is that sort of responsibility and authority and accountability becomes diffused across a whole variety of stakeholders. And as Bob O'Neill, who was, wrote in his contribution to our book, what happens is that it's so diffused that everybody has veto power and nobody has the power to say yes. And so the question is how you get alignment that is external, meaning alignment across partners and between the community and outside entities, so that you have an open process because you need different people to come in and play or different organizations to come in and be participants at different moments. So you need that openness, but then you need to have to structure in accountability for actual work as time goes on. And the thing is that to make that happen, in the places that we've looked at, there are people or institutions who do functions that are brokering and aligning, that do this work as their everyday job. It's a function that requires capacity, that requires funding, and people need to be doing this in these kinds of multifaceted initiatives. And particularly, we really need this as we look toward now the changing sort of landscape of the field, where we see a lot of federal government initiatives coming in, thank goodness. But also, even at the local and state level, we see a whole variety of new actors that weren't around in 1990 doing this work. In the 1990s, when I started in this field, and when Jim Gibson was doing this work at the Rockefeller Foundation, many of them were led by the national foundations working in local communities. Now we see a whole different array of foundations. Joel's from the Wean Foundation. MacArthur is behaving very differently in Chicago. We see a whole array of new foundations. We have community development finance institutions that are doing this work, and a whole range of new kinds of nonprofit and for-profit developers. So managing these relationships is actually a key part of the work, and it needs to be recognized as such and funded. And then finally, there's this, on the one hand, I'm asking you to have a clear theory of change and be very clear about what kinds of outcomes. On the other hand, we know that this is an emergent process. It's organic, it's developmental. We have to learn as we go. So how do you balance both the need for clarity up front and a clear theory of change with an appreciation for the sort of the developmental nature of the work? And the answer to that is to have in place high quality learning and feedback systems that are owned by the people who are doing the work. Fortunately, we have advances in community level data that make this possible, but we have to think about structuring in continuous learning opportunities. And we talk a lot about creating a culture of learning, but there are very few organizations that do this well, but some of them are up here and can help you think about that. So the last thing I want to talk about, and I want to just give you a flavor of this, it's in the book, about sort of what are the challenges going forward. There's a lot of discussion about that. This is sort of some of them. Let me just pick up a couple of them. One of them is, as I was saying earlier, we know that regionalism is important to the future of changing conditions in poor communities. But how do we really operationalize that more than just attaching an inner city resident to a suburban job? How do we really think about operationalizing and making real community to regional linkages? Or a second challenge is population mobility. Marge Turner might be coming here tonight. She and Claudia Colton and Brett Theodos did a report on the two rounds of survey that Making Connections of the Annie Casey Foundation did in their 10 or 11 sites. And they surveyed the families and went back and resurveyed them 3 years later, and 50% of the families had changed addresses in 3 years. Now, we knew there was population mobility in these neighborhoods, but I don't think we knew how much. And we've certainly not thought about it in terms of what it means in terms of delivery of services, thinking about kids in schools, kids in families, and so on, and stability of neighborhoods. And then another big issue going forward is that these are community level interventions that are trying to counter the structural inequities that exist in our country and that are getting worse. And that hasn't changed. And we have to figure out what communities can and can't do and what needs to happen elsewhere. There's a chapter that Alice O'Connor, who's sitting over there, wrote in a book 15 years ago. I think it was called Swimming Against the Tide. All of these great community efforts are swimming against this tide that's moving them back downstream. So those are just a flavor of some of the challenges before us going forward. So the conclusion is that community change is more than just about co-locating some programs. It's not even about initiatives. And there's a chapter that I would commend to you in the book by Mark Joseph that talks about the dangers of initiatives, why the externally imposed initiative with a fixed start and end time and a limited amount of money is expected to turn around a neighborhood and what we've learned about that. That if we're really going to take on community change, we have to think about it, as Tom Burns says in our book, as democratic institution building, or as developing strong, well-anchored, and legitimate community platforms for technical and financial support. And that word platforms we've stolen from the Lisk MacArthur work in Chicago. They use that word, and it seems to capture a lot of what it is that we need to be doing. And in order to do it well, we need clarity about goals in our theory of change. We need intentionality, thinking through alignment both internally within the work itself, but also aligning the various partners, the continuous learning and adaptation. And then finally, if you really want to think about the systems reform work, I think one conclusion from this is that we can't expect that it's going to bubble up from good work on the ground, that the people who have access to the policies and the institutions that really that are making the funding decisions and so on, that's where the systems reform has to happen, and that it's unrealistic to think that people in communities and community efforts can actually provoke that systems level change. That systems level change has to happen at a level where there's the access to it. So that's the quick summary of what we have in the book. I think what I'm going to do now is turn this over to Tom, my colleague Tom, who is going to facilitate a discussion among our fabulous panelists. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. In keeping with the title of the book, we are going to hear from some experienced voices from the field, and we're going to pick just 3 of the many things that we could choose to talk about at length from Anne's presentation and indeed from the book. The first theme that I think we'd like some panelists to comment on, and by the way, we'd like to present all 3 of these themes and have discussion among the panel, and then we'll open it up for discussion from the floor. The first theme is getting real about outcomes. What, in fact, have we learned about the right kinds of outcomes, the right expectations we should have for community efforts, and over what period of time? This idea of scale and dose are very key to thinking about how, in fact, we can get some closer correspondence between aspiration and real experience around outcomes. John Barros is the leader of a very, very long-standing and effective community organization in Boston, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. And I know, John, in your work, you must have come to a point where you have gained some sense about what are the right outcomes to work on and how should we think about that. You want to start us out, John?
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you, Tom, for the question. Unfortunately, too often the question is about the outcome, getting real about the outcome, and not enough about getting real about the level of funding, capacity, and time frame. And, you know, at some point, I think we need to think about what's the kind of floor. You know, don't waste my time if the grant is only X amount, because it's probably not useful given what we're trying to get out of this. And it'd be an interesting different lens to see it from. But given that, you know, there is an outcomes conversation, and given what Ann just talked about in terms of the over-expectation, under-delivery that we've seen over the years, I think for us over the last 27 years, what's been important to us is recognizing that different stakeholders are expecting different things from our community. And then at some point, we decided we'd shift from the national conversation and make sure we were focused on the local conversation. And that the local expectations and conversation around outcome was going to create more of a sustainable platform for us. That in fact, if the power structure who we were trying to create relationships with understood that in fact we could deliver on what we were trying to change, that we could get a better return on investment and energy and focus on our work. And that some of the national players we had been working with come and go and can do it rather easily, where some of the local folks, some of the local funders, our municipal government, and some of the other people were in this with us, right? And so what we started to look at then at the local level was the fact that the things that mattered to them was in fact that we were partner ready. That our mayor would call on us and send resources our way because he actually did want to make changes in neighborhoods like ours because he thought it was the best investment, right? That when the Salvation Army came to and said, oh, we've got an opportunity to build community centers around the country and we might want to look at Boston, he didn't hesitate. He said, call John Barros at DS&I. And for us, that kind of outcome that says that we can run process effectively and we can be engaged in civil discourse in a way that looks at zoning, looks at planning, and some other things, for us is a real outcome. The other one locally that I think is important for us is we continue to produce leadership out of that neighborhood. And at this point, we've got 3 straight state reps. We've got a city councilor. You know, the mayor thinks that we can take his job. You know, our sheriff. I mean, so the hero story or the leadership development stories out of our neighborhood are also important outcomes. And then I think on a national level, because I know I've talked too much already, but that the Promised Neighborhoods framing of educational outcomes for children presents a very compelling set of outcomes that we've interpreted our neighborhood as, if we can find the most dependent part of our community, people who live in our community, and we can improve our lives, then we stand to believe that we then have improved the whole system. So if the children are the most dependent part of our community, and we can draw out the relationships that they're depending on, and then impact those relationships. So you would have parents and family, concerned adults, you would have local businesses, local programming, local services, and if we can say we can do enough around the child to improve their academic outcome, that's a pretty compelling for us system to look at in our neighborhood to say then we think that the ecology in our neighborhood around support would be stronger.
Right.
And we think we could actually sell that at the national level in a way that we haven't been able to with other ways of looking at our initiative.
Thank you. Elena, I want to ask you, Elena is currently a program officer at the MacArthur Foundation, but previously served as the deputy of the Partnership for New Communities in Chicago, which was a funder collaborative, time-limited, to help the Chicago Housing Authority's plan for transformation. So you have both a kind of administrative and a program officer point of view. And I think you may be in a position to interpret how it is that this platform idea brought to life and made kind of living, owned by the neighborhood, can actually help with this question of focus and generating real outcomes.
Yep. Well, I think, you know, what Mayor Menino called investment ready is what we sort of at the partnership, as a very small, fund-constrained entity that had been charged with a very ambitious set of goals, we saw the same thing when we looked. You know, we had several neighborhoods we wanted to work in. We wanted to make some progress on neighborhood development goals. And as an outsider, you're looking for organization, you're looking for a plan in place, you're looking for the buy-in and sort of, credible buy-in of a lot of stakeholders. And we found that platform and that, something to build on in the Quad Communities Development Corporation, which is one of these CDCs that is a partner in the Local Initiative Support Corporation's New Communities program. And they had been working in the Quad communities for a couple of years, had gone through a comprehensive quality of life planning process, had great staff in place, and they were demonstrating that they had a track record for getting projects done. And so when you're a small foundation or when you're an outsider foundation looking to make impact in a place, it was very important to have that credibility. And so it was sort of, you knew it when you saw it. But I think now the challenge is, as a funder now, stepping into the funder seat in a different way, we have to hold ourselves very accountable to demonstrating that you can quantify and measure what that platform is. And I think we can bring, all of us, that kind of discipline and that expectation of discipline to measuring the platform, or what does it mean to be investment ready? Because I think there are ways of doing it. There's a response essay, it's Alan Okagaki's response essay in Voices, where he points out there is a whole field of management literature, and what we've expected of these neighborhood organizations is that they're just doing the process.
Right.
The process is just happening. We want outcomes. We want the products.
Right.
But I think it's, we have to pay attention to how we're producing it and make sure that we're funding effective production mechanisms. And I think, again, you do know it when you see it, but I think drawing those lessons out about what makes good management and good documentation of process and good communication, all of those things, add up to something. And I think we need to be measuring it not just as an interim outcome, but as a product of something.
Right. Would anybody else on the panel like to weigh in on this question of getting real about outcomes? Jennifer?
I would be glad to. I thought what Dudley Street did was really pioneering, and I think some of the folks like Dudley and some of the early Casey initiative work or Abyssinia CDC, some of those folks that, we're all standing on the learnings, right, that those guys had to live through. And you didn't mention this, John, but I think one of the reasons, I would only hypothesize that one of the reasons that after 27 years you're still really strong and at it also has to do with what I would call who decides what the outcome is matters, right? And I think typically it's government or foundations in the old model that would come in and say, community, we want you to change in these ways, without seeing themselves as part of that kind of ecosystem of change. I think in the Dudley model, what was so powerful for those of us who followed in the field was the community voice. And having residents step forward and say, here's the issues of common concern that we want to put forward, and here's how we're going to measure success. There's a woman in our neighborhood who said her Mexican grandmother always uses this line, "Don't do about me without me." And I think there's a really powerful lesson in that.
Thank you. Zev?
First of all, good evening, everybody. It's a real treat to be here, and a big thank you and congrats to Anne and all the team for just a wonderful and I think a very, very timely report. And it's a treat to be here. I think some of these themes will run together in a way that's really useful. I think the sequence is nice too, because when we talk about accountability and learning, the question of accountability for what and what's actually achievable and how do we ensure an honest conversation about that's enormously important. I'll pick up on just one thread of the exchange so far, and that is things like leadership development, as opposed to affordable housing units or jobs created or these other kinds. Now, they're all important in different ways, as folks in this room know very well. I would say that, it remains, from my perspective, and this includes things like going to make the case to a Congress that is, to say the least, challenging to work with these days. It includes things like taking the quote-unquote soft outcomes, like leadership development or things that may contribute to civic capacity, and making them tangible enough for people that you can influence decision-making. And a few people in the room have heard me tell this story. I'll give the very quick version. Some years back when I spent time in India, as part of a project on civic capacity in different parts of the world. One of the things I will never forget is interviewing the vice president of a very fast-growing Indian bank, essentially about the question, why would you guys partner with slum dwellers? Like, what's in it for you? Why do you do it? What exactly do you gain from it? And to boil it all down, these guys had figured out, in the language of project finance, how working with capable organizations at the grassroots level lowered their execution risk in tangible ways that matter. Now, you don't always get moments like that or a financial calculus to distill everything, but I think these kinds of things and continuing at the effort of making it tangible enough is enormously important.
And in the spirit of transition to next themes, it's a good lead into the next theme I'd like to ask the panel to weigh in on, and that's the theme of alignment, both within the community, among the different players in this very complicated situation, dynamic as well as complicated, and also the alignment between the community and outside forces. It's not so easy to figure out how one navigates and how one learns from good examples of effective alignment so that you can actually improve your own practice, which is a kind of jump or almost leap of faith sometimes. Raphael, would you start us out on this theme of alignment? I know you've thought about it within the federal government, but you also have at least one, maybe several former lives where you thought about it on the ground as a practitioner. So.
Sure. I wanted to echo Zav's thank you for invitation. When I thought about the question of the issue of alignment, what I kept coming back to is the question of, well, what do you need? Right? What are the pieces that you need to have in place if you're going to have these sorts of efforts, initiatives, programs, transformations actually be effective? And there are really a couple of categories. And you have the hard resource that John talked about. You need the capital, you need the investment, you need sort of people on the ground that have technical skills. And then there's a whole host of soft things. Shared vision, so an understanding of what a problem is. Information about what your options are to make a difference. Honesty, an openness and a self-awareness. Respect between the partners. And a real trust that the partners are going to be there 2 years later, 4 years later, 5 years later. I come from an academic environment where universities will pop in, do a little 8-month deal, and then they're not around anymore. All of those sorts of experiences shape what you can and can't do. And the challenge of place-based policy is really that in every place, the mix of those things and the ability to really succeed in those things is different.
Right.
And so you have to think about what that context is. So when you think about what role should entities play, it's a really hard question, because depending on the local context, different players should be doing different things. I think about the federal government. So it's been a sobering experience for me to come to Washington and have to think about neighborhoods, communities, cities and regions in a context where I have like one instrument that's got to work in like 600,000 different contexts. And if you think about specifics that we should do, to me, I feel like one of the common things that we can do is really be a facilitator around information, around helping to build peer networks so that learning and that collaboration takes place in an effective way, and really try to be an aggregator in a very specific way. Then you get to the state and local governments. You have you have some vision builders that can happen at both levels. I think that this emphasis on leadership is particularly important, and you've got to have leadership at multiple levels. You've got to have champions at the local level who can be the voice of the community, who can be the voice to the community.
Right.
You've got to have champions at sort of the governmental level, because there are going to be lots of meetings when that local champion is not going to be there. And you've got to have sort of a federal awareness that things are happening, that things can happen. And I will say, the federal government is only so-so on that, right? So I travel around a lot. I get to see a lot of our folks on the ground and field officers, and actually get to observe how they engage with their local partners. Some are really good, and some, I feel like I have better relationships with the local partners.
Right.
And that's really hard. So I think all that's important. And then the last piece I wanted to say, because I'm going on too long as well, is that the foundational role and the role of sort of nonprofits and others who haven't always played sort of that other leg to the stool,
Right.
is evolving in ways that are really interesting and important. And I think that thinking about, and for them to think about how they engage consistently,
Right.
And create those partnerships and alignments is something that I'm interested to watch and weigh in on as we go forward.
Well, it's a perfect introduction of our next panelist, Joel Ratner, who is the living third leg, who looked at the context of Youngstown, Ohio, a challenged context, to be sure, that was undergoing rapid change, massive demoralization, if I can say, and finds himself now leading a local foundation with modest resources, but with authority and a kind of presence. So I think it would be great if you could shed some light on how it is you went about figuring out how you could play a useful role in that mix, given the realities of your limited resources and so forth.
I think we started by trying to create a local alignment and building bridges and believing that everybody was a potential partner. So we invested first in the development of a leadership and engagement effort called the Mahoning Valley Organizing Collaborative, which you referenced, Tom, in your article, which in terms of accountability, we think has shown great results. So you say that you're surprised they have such a great relationship with the city, and they are almost a city in exile in that the city has so little capacity, they frankly have to do a lot of the city's work. But not just do they have a great relationship with the city, they have a great relationship with the local Chamber of Commerce. I think that's even more surprising, who understands that the organizing effort gives us local capacity. So instead of being threatened by it, they've seized on it. The example I'll give you, and where we're getting very clear results in about 3 years that we've been working on this, the organizing collaborative didn't exist. We give them a very major grant, and we expect results. So they identified vacant properties in Youngstown, no surprise there, as something that they needed to take on. And one of the first tools that we needed was a county land bank, which there was no state law allowing a county land bank except in the Cleveland area. So they worked hard and actually changed the state law. So about 6 months ago, the state of Ohio allowed for county land banks, based very much on Dan Kildee's model in Flint. But we couldn't do it before, now we can do it. And then through a regional alignment, they found the money through the Fund for Economic Future. Some of you know about it, Cleveland, Akron, Canton coming together, sponsored a contest for government collaboration. And the way you got the money was by getting the most votes. So again, by virtue of having an engagement effort on the ground, we were able to get that funded by that won the most votes in the government collaboration effort because it's a county land bank. So they've gotten us, there's the regional alignment. The city, of course, is very glad to have the county land bank, the county, the state by passing the state legislation. So we think it's fair to expect results, and we are constantly working to have that internal alignment. Now we're working with the cities and the anchor institutions, which I see Living Cities is represented here. We're thrilled to be part of a Living Cities integration initiative effort as part of a replication of work that's going on in Cleveland. So we're very excited about that. We see that again as creating alignment on the ground. I'll just say this, I'll wrap up. I know you want to keep it moving. The national alignment is harder and more frustrating, and Raphael referred to it. The Mahoning Valley Organizing Collaborative has actually gotten a number of meetings with the Secretary of HUD and Sean Donovan. Now there's a couple local residents of Youngstown who thinks it's normal to get a meeting with Sean Donovan because they've had several and they don't, yeah. So we've been able to get those meetings and have that dialogue, and we had Mercedes Marquez into Youngstown recently, and have been talking a lot with Mr. Sims at HUD, so have begun to create that relationship. But we did really badly with neighborhood stabilization money, and we feel that neighborhood stabilization was set up for us to fail. It was about the coast from our point of view, and even to the extent within Ohio, it was set up to benefit the 3 Cs, Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, who are much bigger and have much more power. So the city of Columbus, which has an abandonment foreclosure problem 2 or 3 times the size of Youngstown, got 30 times as much money as we did. Because we can't compete with them. And the neighborhood stabilization round 2, we didn't get any, but we're not bitter.
You're busy.
Yes. So aligning with the federal piece has been really hard because of the local context, and again, programs which you talked about, one size fits all, and you're struggling with that, and we're struggling with that too from the other end. And the other thing, and I've been called blunt recently, and
Really?
and yes, and provocative. But the aligning with the national foundations is even harder. From our point of view, they're fickle, and with all due respect to everyone in the room, they're fickle and they're opaque and they're too political. And so we're very much in flyover territory. I mean, Cleveland a little less so for them, but Youngstown, and we're a second-tier city. So we really struggled to get their attention, much less to get their money.
Right.
So the alignment with the national institutions is much more difficult.
Okay. Someone else like to weigh in on the alignment issue? It's ripples through all aspects of this work, either the internal or external alignment question.
I guess I might just add that it's a continual process. It's so interesting. You can start out as a kind of key partner, key funder in an initiative or a project, or just try not to use initiative. I feel like
you can use just think about what you mean when you say it.
As long as there's no time limit at the end, it's okay.
Exactly. But when supporting comprehensive community development work and supporting the evaluation of that work, you really have to be intentional about supporting that ongoing dialogue when you're wrestling with complicated issues and questions. It's not that you set your theory of change in the beginning and then you update it at the interim report. It really has to be a fluid, well-documented process. And I think it doesn't. Those are easy things it seems like to do, but it's actually hard in practice to hold yourselves really accountable to creating memos after meetings and making sure that everybody gets those memos. And it sounds like a small thing, and it just ends up not being a small thing in many instances because you're getting clarity about language, expectations, and when you're using words like platform, for example, well, you really have to break that down. What does that mean to different people?
It's continuous adaptation.
It is continuous adaptation.
One of the measures that I always look for when I visit a local group as to whether there's alignment is whether people can describe what others' role is accurately.
Right.
And maybe even what they could do in addition to what they're currently doing, because gradually alignment is also about knowing the potential and the limits of your partners, which is part of working knowledge to get real alignment.
I just want to say it's going to be really difficult for me to take initiative outside of Dudley Street Neighbor Initiative.
We weren't after a shorter name for your organization.
But I want to recognize, I think I want to echo what Raphael said about the soft part of this, the soft skills, the trust, the sense that we actually understand how to communicate with one another is something that's really difficult when we think about investment ready. That I continue to struggle with from a neighborhood perspective, community perspective. And it's just refreshing to see who's in government now, who I'm talking to now. It's like, so 20 years later, we've grown some capacity on the ground, but who's making some of the decisions, policy decisions have changed. The conversation with Sav Briggs is very different today because there is a level of trust. There are nuances to the conversation that I don't have to explain. There's an understanding that's different. And so I do think that we are growing a cadre of leadership, of policymakers in the country that in fact is community ready. Right? So there's investment-ready communities, but is our country becoming more community-ready?
That's good.
Could the investments in community now have more effectiveness because of that? I think it's an interesting way to look at it.
All right. Zav, were you trying to jump in here?
I was. Two quick thoughts. One, building on Elena's point, my perennial concern as a sometime educator is the skill set, too. And there are all sorts of human resource opportunities in this, and it gets back to John's point about who you're dealing with. Half of HUD, roughly, is eligible for retirement. A number of the folks in that agency signed up when it was the place to be, to change the world. That was their value proposition. They went in the 60s and 70s. And each of them has a story, but they will be departing. There is a renewal opportunity.
Right.
And HUD is one, right, of 1,000 different examples of the same sort of story, but what do you recruit for? How do you develop your people? It's both inside of organizations. It's a challenge to the academy as well.
Right.
Soft skills and hard skills, quite different to teach, sometimes difficult to name. I think John is right. I think I'm seeing the same thing. I'm certainly working from my little corner of the world to up the community literacy, if you will. And it's a real challenge. You say things like place-based, and the almost instinctive reaction, or one of them, in the federal government is, oh, you're talking about another empowerment zone kind of a thing. I mean, the fixation is you're about to pick up another special club of 12 places and shower them with love. And everyone else will be out in the cold.
Yeah.
In other words, you're going to target, you're going to earmark, you're going to something. That's one of the instincts. So it's a challenge on a bunch of levels, but inch by inch.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the third theme that we'd like some panel discussion on, and then we'll open it up to the floor. The third theme is worth thinking about is accountability and building in this culture of learning, this culture of results that seems so key to getting some real progress here. It's easier said than done, and getting specific examples of how it works, how it's fine-tuned, how it's grown. I think we have some experience on the panel to help us with. Jennifer, could you describe how you've struggled with that in San Diego?
Yeah, well, and I think you guys have hit it on this book in the sense of these are the big conundrums, right, of the next phase of our work. I think this alignment issue is more than a notion when you're working with brownfields and toxic waterways and poor off-ramps of interstates and floodplains, and trying to align state and federal and local and community resources, I think is probably the next big learning for us. We certainly started our work on the theory that people had to own their own change, that you really have to have large-scale civic action of people stepping out of their homes, tackling the issues of common concern in these larger partnerships, and to have a really powerful voice in it. And I took this quote from the book. I was really moved by it, that we need new ways of being strategic when we are working in a complex adaptive system. We need new ways of managing the work when we have to interact with so many actors. We need new forms of accountability when we are innovative and trying unproven strategies. And I think that very often, and I think the outcomes and the accountability parts are linked, that when they're really pre-prescribed, there is a tendency to kill the flexibility and freedom of people to truly grapple and innovate on the ground. And we've seen such extraordinary
and reflect.
Yeah.
You're quoted in the book, by the way, as needing to rethink this kind of framework every 3 years.
Every couple of years.
Which is a little different than picking a theory of change and staying with it until you go over the cliff.
Well,
right?
actually, we've stayed really, really close to our theory of change. We have a very tight theory and a very, very solid set of values.
Right.
The complexity is always managing to that value set, right, and organizing yourself to implement to those values. I think you were hitting on that as a really, really important point in terms of how we all learn to partner and align. One of the problems, and I'll oversimplify this for for this discussion, but you know, you've got a situation at our neighborhood levels really where they've been the markets haven't worked, and there's been a failure of government in those situations to start with, right? So government doesn't necessarily own the full accountability for coming to the table and solving that. You have foundations who very largely were outside the situation, trying to hold nonprofits accountable for those outcomes, but not seeing ourselves as part of that ecosystem of change. You've got the resident players who largely feel disempowered and don't believe that change is even possible or that it should be the government that comes in and solves it. Then you've got, you tend to have the poor nonprofit in the middle of all of this, trying to be accountable, who feels responsible and has the weight of the responsibility, but in some ways doesn't deeply feel the ownership of it because it's been pre-prescribed by somebody upstream.
Right.
So, you know, we do think that in this next generation of work that we all grapple with, that we need to be in that deeper discussion about roles and how we all own our own stuff, right? In that, and hold ourselves accountable to not just expecting that change will happen out there, but that change will happen within our partnerships that will allow that creativity and innovation to flourish.
Right.
So learning systems are critical. We kid in our organization that if anybody can tell the difference between a failure and a learning, we like to call them learnings because it feels better than the failures. But our founder, who gave us a great risk-taking set of values, loved saying, you know, that Babe Ruth struck out 1,330 times, that allowing things to fail, we've seen it time and time again, is really where you get the great creativity and the great breakthroughs. To let people just sit there and look at it and grapple with it has really led to these really extraordinary breakthroughs, and it gives people a very strong sense of ownership.
Right.
And that's, I think, ultimately how change happens and how deep accountability for the change process occurs.
Right.
We have had to tie all the players together.
You've had to create forums where people felt safe enough to reflect on what's really happening. Yeah.
Yes, and we also had, from a management point of view, tied the development functions to the community organizing functions, to the capacity building functions, and to the grant making functions, and any other kind of investment and PRI strategies, so that you can't allow the developer to take off without the community builder, because you've got two different languages, two different sets of pace and dynamics, and it's created a very rich learning experience. You can't just say, oh, the developer's the enemy, because then you have to look across the table and go, well, the enemy is us, right? And how do we need to change our own internal policies, our own internal way of thinking, to be able to be relevant to community change?
I just want to make a really quick comment. To me, there's one of the nuggets is that for Dudley Street and Jacobs, that I think they're models about, is that the strategies are aligned. So, and all the strategies are aligned. So it's internally, yes, because there's so often that people think that there are huge pieces that aren't them and aren't even thinking about aligning them. So it is aligning every one of those strategies and keeping them all moving forward together, and keeping all those players talking to each other, and creating a venue so that they see that we're in this together.
Right. And that alignment, I mean, that's what makes these comprehensive projects more than the sum of a cluster of individual projects. It's not additive. There's this presumption that it's going to be, exponentially better.
There is a synergy.
Right, and I think we have to be, it's at that moment that we have to really hold all of ourselves accountable to how you measure that, that extra.
But I do think that Jennifer hits on an important thing, which is, I had written this down earlier, the notion of risk and uncertainty, and that everything you try is not going to work.
Right.
And what does that mean for accountability, and what are we accountable for and to? And we often don't articulate that. The possibility of failure is not something you often want to introduce at the beginning. And so you have to think about how you're going to manage that. And it really gets back to sort of the first area. Maybe we're coming full circle, but what are the outcomes that we want to have people think about?
Right.
What's the ambition that we have and that we're trying to chase? It's a real challenge because when the failure happens, and it will happen at some point, you've got to be able to manage that and make sure everyone, when you fall down, you get back up again.
Right.
And that's you've got to be managing to that as well.
So part of the capacity, I think, of managing that is one thing we're working on is how do we have our own research, our own analysis, our own evaluation capacity, right, on the ground.
As
so that we
Dudley
can-
Street, as the initiative.
As communities.
Yeah.
Right? We think about what capacities do we need to build, so we need to build, connections, we need to build social capital, et
Performance
cetera.
management, right.
Yeah.
We need to be able to say, okay, the funders are looking at these set of things, but we think these things are really rich learnings. Quick, let's do some data gathering, let's do some surveying, even though they're not there with us, because there's a set of rich learnings that have passed us by. And even as I look back the past 2 decades, I'm like, oh, if we only had, really gathered that data at that point and then looked at years later what happened to those families and have them tell that story. And so one of the things that I know we're committed to now on the ground, Jeffrey Camden's my hero on this, right, and he tells stories about people who wanted to talk about his data, and he said, hold on a second, that's our story. And we're going to tell you about how that's told, so it's done in an empowering framework, that it's done in a way that we move forward together, and it's not, something that makes us feel bad about ourselves. And so it would be interesting if at the front end, then we embedded risk management, right, in it internally.
Right.
Right, so that it didn't have to come from policymakers, but it had to come because we really want to improve.
Right.
I mean, there's so many really rich themes here. I just wanted to jump on a couple of them for a moment. Number one, it is quite something, John, to work with planners or planning students, for example, around the world, by the way, not just Americans, on this issue of community knowledge, local knowledge. Right. What does it mean? And not have them retreat into a defensive posture because they fear you're telling them their expertise is worthless. Their job is simply to become a community scribe, to sort of sit there and faithfully record and not to have views, as opposed to engage in a vibrant, sometimes contentious process that can empower people, that can challenge them at the same time, but that produces learning. The other thing I wanted to say for a quick sec is, and we have come, I think, full circle in a lot of ways, I mean, in the spirit of measuring gains, it feels to me like this is a crisper, sharper conversation on a number of levels than the conversation we were having 10 years ago or further back.
Right.
It's a field of fields, first of all.
Yes.
It's always been tricky to sort of define. It's been very values-driven. It's had lots of dilemmas, no shortage of them. And one of the many reasons I love the new report is that it talks about things like operating strategies, specific templates and recipes for getting hard stuff done. The other thing that I think we're talking about tonight, and it is where we started in terms of the getting real theme, and it's something we're working on within the Obama administration. I just wanted to share. Accountable for what? So what kinds of outcomes are we actually trying to produce? And I'm going to stick on the hard outcomes for just a moment. We were talking earlier about the so-called soft that are also hugely important. But things like employment, especially in this economy, right? Job creation, employment rates, some of the hardest, most vital stuff. What we're trying for, one of the things we're trying for, and I'm about to say it much more bluntly than you'll see in any NOFA, right, that we put out. I mean, one of our messages really is, folks, there's no time and no money to spare, right? Countries at sort of a crisis point, a turning point. Please don't try to boil the ocean. That's one of the critical messages. And it's tricky to convey, it's tricky to explain to, again, Congress and others are much more accustomed to having you sort of paint a picture about a huge need and tremendous merit and justify things that way, and to try to flip the conversation and say, we actually have built up a body of knowledge about what works in some areas.
Right.
And in those areas, we want to see a higher road approach. And we think it's time to be more demanding in some ways. And in other areas, frankly, we still have a ton of learning to do. You know, the knowledge is still more nascent, the practices are less established.
Right.
And that's a different sort of challenge. The one other thing I wanted to mention, Anne touched on the dynamism of neighborhoods, or the neighborhood turnover, neighborhood change dynamic. Jim is here from MDRC tonight. This is a huge issue in the way, for example, the Jobs Plus demonstration was put together, and how MDRC and the funder partners and the communities implementing it tried to learn from it. And you literally could not understand its impacts unless you tracked people over time, including people who moved away. You know, 17 years ago in the South Bronx, I was a community planner. Of course, we were using the language transform neighborhoods. That was the ambition. The neighborhood turnover was off the charts. You could see it playing out. And if I had one wish in this domain, it's not, frankly, though I care about that too, the kind of formal evaluation and the way you try to design to account for all that change. If I had one wish in this space, it would be that people in the field embrace a different mental model. And it relates to that whole, it relates to the mantra, don't try to boil the ocean. I mean, one of the keys to not doing that, not falling in that trap, it seems to me, is saying, you know what, there are people who are here who don't plan, frankly, to be around a long time. And I may not be able to change that. That may be beyond me. And I got to think about them in one sort of way. There are others who want to be here, and they're deeply rooted. And I want to make that the very best choice it can be. I want to improve their quality of life. And I want to, by the way, see if I can engage them as community assets in being leaders, in bringing others in, and so on. And then there may be, you know, all kinds of types in between. But you would think very differently, it seems to me, about your intervention, about how you spend time, and so on. If you, and I'm not sort of saying this is completely unknown in the field, but I can promise you, in the Bronx years ago, it was not something that those on the front lines had at the forefront of their minds. They had something that I would characterize as urban village on the brain. This is a place that is going to be a wonderful, stable place. And again, to put it maybe too bluntly and maybe too harshly, it was New York City. These were low-rent neighborhoods. The neighborhood was serving a function in one of the world's most dynamic, most staggeringly unequal housing markets and labor markets. You got to get real, folks. You're playing a role in that much bigger machine. And you want to think about what that means and about the dynamism of people's lives and the fact that many stream through. If you're going to touch them, if you're going to reach them, if you're going to be able to focus your efforts and actually be able to point to something at the end of the day that you've accomplished.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up now. We're not going to use cards, so I will get the mic to people who would like to direct a question. Please try to make it a question more than a statement. And it could be on one of the themes that we've already raised. It might be on something else you heard in Anne's presentation or you know is in the book. Anybody?
Hi, Mark Tomizawa, 6 Degrees of Innovation. It's a neighborhood-driven think tank that works across platforms where nobody makes money because people are much more warm about sharing what they know will work if there's nobody's job on the line. Here's quick things. You talked about President Obama. He wants government as a platform for democracy. So we're looking at platforms that make that faster and easier for groups of coalitions to identify who should work together, right? It's matchmaking. And moving forward, looking at maps with real-time assets, deficits. In other words, it's almost like you have a war room, pardon me, of real-time opportunity, right? And if you map the people within that, you now know the organizations and the track histories who will fit together well. And then the foundations will know how to work as coalitions themselves and fund that.
Okay, do you have a question for somebody on the panel?
Who else is working on this? Because if you don't have systems, tools, it's going to continue to be really hard to spend human time well.
So I agree with that completely. And my group has actually taken a leadership role. Actually, Zav suggested some of this. We've convened a bunch of interagency working groups that are really oriented toward building collaborative and comprehensive systems so communities can tell what assets they have on the ground. This is critical, and it actually runs through just about every one of our programs as we're moving forward. Our sustainable communities, we've asked the areas to tell us and document where they're going to be. HUD as an agency, and we, the Secretary has instructed me, we are to be the first geo-enabled agency in the federal government, really to help places see themselves as places with the things that they have on the ground, visual, so they can start to make those decisions. The other thing I did want to say is that I think you're absolutely right in another regard, in that one of our biggest challenges is really the diversity of capacity in systems at the local level. So it is, particularly in localities, it is often virtually impossible for them to tell you what's going on, let alone for you to find out what's going on. And as long as we're in an environment where it's to some extent serendipity, whether you can tell what's going on, it's hard to imagine this getting to scale in a significant way. So we've got to find venues and ways to invest in that almost invisible infrastructure. It gets back to what are we measuring, what are the outcomes that would be desirable,
Right.
So that we can then leverage that and really start to take big leaps in the future.
It also gets to the point of learning, right? So at this point, we took an inventory in the community we thought wanted us to take care of 14 different major items, everything from access to technology in the community to health, environment, right? And so oh, we can't work on this, right? So we said to ourselves, we need to think systemically about what the drivers are, right? Do you work on safety, or do you work on education and employment? Right? There's certain things that drive certain outcomes, right? So the community might want you to look at those things and pay attention to them, but you've got to have a systems type of conversation. You got to know what's going on. It talks to you about gaps, it talks to you about needs, it talks to you about opportunities, and where you invest maybe at certain times. And without those kind of tools, as you're making changes in the middle, or there are new sets of information, or the context changes around you, you kind of get lost in your thinking.
Right.
Unless you can hold it, have something. We're working on a youth systems violence project, where we actually, somebody has built, according to gangsters in the neighborhood and youth, and people who are pulling triggers, how you get in gangs and out of gangs. Right? So there is a story. It tells you, here's the decision I made to get into a gang. Here's what happened in my life. Here is when I became a shooter in a gang. Here's why I didn't become a shooter in a gang. Here's why I became a shooter outside of an organized gang. Just all of these major platforms and the interventions that got them in, and the interventions that got some of these folks out. So we did interviews, focus groups. Now we've got a system on a computer that pulls a lever and says, if the police department conducts a sweep, here's what we think will happen.
Yeah.
Right, giving all of the chains of events based on how people make decisions. If there is a foundation program, that intervention, that we now have more jobs, here's what we think happens. If there is a combination of the two, we think this will happen. And so this stuff is very tricky. So not only do we need to know what's happening, but we need to think about relationships.
Yes.
Given increases or decreases in certain things.
And getting to consider non-programmatic solutions, because some of those kids stop because of connections to girlfriends, peers, employers, and not necessarily juvenile offender programs, some of which are effective. But
Absolutely.
The program-centric quality of a lot of problem-solving limits our sense of options. Another question out here, possibly? Yes.
I've got one. Hi.
Christine.
I'm lucky enough to get to work with Jennifer at Market Creek. So I've got a question, John. You mentioned about leadership and the leadership pipeline, and wow, now you have elected officials among your alums, sort of, it sounds like, right? So one of the things, and I'm just new at Jacobs since June, so I don't know chapter and verse, just chapter, or just verse, right? But we really try and stay away it seems like over the history of the organization, we've stayed away from the word leadership. We try and stay away from the word governance to let it just happen. And I'm interested in, is there a point at which, especially because we're going to be sunsetting the foundation and we're going to be turning over something, assets and ideas, there is governance that will have, things will have to be governed or whatever the word is. So I'm just kind of interested in how you, in the natural leaders emerge, but what about the non-natural leaders? I'm just kind of interested in that.
Mm-hmm. So we speak heavily about governance. We talk about leadership all the time. If you assume there needs to be governance at the end, should have happened yesterday, because governance is not easy. Very complex beast to think about local government and to think about building the capacity for people to work together so that they can govern in a collective sense. So our governance structure has a racial overlay where we have, because of our census numbers and population, 4 African American seats, 4 white seats, predominantly Irish and Italian Old Guard. And they're only 7% of our neighborhood. 4 Cape Verdean seats, West African immigrants. 4 Latino seats, predominantly Dominican and Puerto Rican, because that's how the neighborhood saw leadership. And the biggest question for them in knowing that they were involved was that there was someone from their ethnic group at the table, right? Then we brought in the other stakeholders, the local stakeholders, and made a decision that we didn't want any kind of government officials at the table. So there's many ways to think about leadership. Governance, I would say, start now. And then leave them a huge endowment so they can make decisions and input. But the question of leadership, when we decided that education outcome was going to be important to how we're going to systemically look at our neighborhood and think about the child as the most dependent part of that system and how we improve all the system, all the support networks around it. We said, okay, well, we think we're going to sit on the school committee. And we talked to the mayor and I got appointed to the school committee. That's leadership. When you decide that you want to be able to have a voice at a certain table, and you decide that you can actually look at the people around you in your neighborhood that's supposed to be a devastated neighborhood, poor neighborhood, likely to be incarcerated neighborhood, and say, here are the leaders that we're working with. We need to put you in this position, we need to put you in that position, we need to put you in that position, so you can affect the collective plan of this neighborhood and be a servant to that shared vision, to that shared set of values, to that shared plan. For us is how we want to work with our leaders. When we decided that we wanted the state legislators to have a different conversation about some of these policies, we said, we're running some folks. Who's stepping up? Right?
Yeah, just a comment, because we're very intentional, I would say, about leadership development. We have tried to stay away from the word, and I think partly because there is the question about who anoints the leaders, right? And when we first started, we were coming off some of the early research of the CCI field, which you talked about, Anne, a lot in the book, with lead agencies. And if I would have 3 people at my table for a conversation, all 3 of them would call me afterwards and complain about the other 2, and say, don't trust them, So you start aligning with people who see themselves as the leader or the self-appointed leader or even appointed leaders. It's very complicated when you're starting out, and we felt that it was a better entry to do very open process. Everybody's at the table, huge teams, and to try to be very careful about not appearing to anoint leadership because of some role that we were in, that we were going to work as neighbors and allow that to naturally emerge. Now it's different because we have this kind of meta network of networks with 9 cultural groups and 9 other kind of networks within the neighborhood, community networks. And they are now looking at being a primary feeder system for leadership training. So you'll be accountable to your Somali or Sudanese or Samoan community if you're in that leadership training to take that back and lead. And the discussion's more on collaborative leadership,
Right.
not organizational leadership.
Right.
And so that's kind of the next frame that we're really trying to figure out and think deeply about for the next phase of this.
Well, you want to say?
I like what I heard, and I don't know if this is an alternative viewpoint or sort of supports it, but I think along with intentionality, I think it's really important to create an incredible system that is constantly fermenting and changing and allowing paths to leadership. So I think it is about constantly. So for us, it's a small grants program, in which the committee members decide who gets the grants, and the committee rotates all the time. So so that the pathways to leadership don't get blocked, or people don't kind of hold on to them, and those are the leaders, and we're not. So constantly creating this opportunity for ferment and new leadership. And as we know, there's such incredible transience in the neighborhoods that it's important that we don't block things up, because that's not how the neighborhoods are. But again, allowing let 1,000 flowers bloom, and constantly creating that field where all those flowers can bloom.
Do we have a last question in the room? We do have time for schmoozing and visiting and actually conversation and following the panel. Jim?
Yeah, I'm wondering, maybe Ann and other panelists, how do you see the lessons from this research? How do you see the lessons from this exploration applying to choice neighborhoods and promised neighborhoods? And I guess I'd address that to anyone on the panel familiar with those programs.
I think they're great.
Couple thoughts. One, we've got some specific challenges when it comes to alignment, even within the so-called federal family. There's a lot of will in this administration. There's a lot of energy being invested by very capable, very, very good people. But you're working in an area where, on one hand, again, Congress is not neatly organized to facilitate this, point number one. Point number two, I think it's a very interesting fiscal and political and economic moment. On one hand, it's a moment wherein you can say things like, let's get real. You know, we don't have capacity, time, money to spare. You can be insistent. There's that kind of leveraging the moment for reform. On the other hand, you know, desperate times also make people hunker down and defend territory and focus on holding on to what they've got. And we also see that dynamic. And I'm not trying to characterize it as strictly parochial. I think there's a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety. And it gets to, again, some of the tensions between being demanding, setting a high bar, but trying to work with people in that space, and, you know, being inclusive, allocating resources more broadly, seeing that everybody has something to plug their gaps with. And boy, are there a lot of gaps to go around. So those are some of the things, Jim, that are tricky in all this. As to the substance of the hope, if you could sort of you know, abstract away from those governance questions and some of the difficulties of actually resourcing across silos and those other things that we hope to do, I'd say it's quite striking, actually. You can find that when you look at a program meant to revitalize neighborhoods that has a particular focus and history to it, such as Hope 6 at HUD, and you try to create an evolution, if not a revolution, in that program. You try to really figure out what you've learned and build on it. It's incredibly easy, I find, to spend time dealing with a lot of the things that are collateral to the core of the intervention, sort of work on the problems of dislocation and all the things that the intervention does to sort of stir things up. And that's important for one set of reasons. And there have been a lot of bitter battles over those things, as you know, in this and many other programs aimed at the poor and at disadvantaged neighborhoods over the years. But it's incredibly easy in that picture to actually forget the simple things at the core. What precisely are we trying to achieve? Are we being honest with ourselves about whether it's doable? Surely we don't want to hardwire certain things into legislation. That would make it very hard to adapt and to learn. But when it comes time to actually, you know, preparing a kind of call for, send us your best stuff. Here's what we can look at. What's the guidance we're going to give? I mean, the other funders here are talking about it tonight, and evaluators and others in the room know the problem very well. we're 30,000 feet up, and to try to aggregate these lessons and think about where you want to prod, where you want to insist, where you want to leave some room to learn some things, because there are going to be surprises. That's, I would say, an ongoing challenge, but Raphael should say what he thinks too.
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things strike me. One is sort of where we started around the expectations about what can happen tomorrow, what can happen in 2 years, and what can happen in 5 years. And this notion of over-promising versus under-delivering, and making sure that you calibrate those things. And as we look to our candidates, making sure that we have some conversations early on about some of the risks and pitfalls that we have in place. I think there are some real nuggets to learn from here. We were at the Promised Neighborhoods thing yesterday, and another thing that struck me was the notion of a network, and very early on trying to establish these networks so that these learning opportunities arise, so that lessons actually transmit from one organization to another. And really, so that we start to get to a place where people don't feel like they have to grope in the dark and can actually work together. And the last thing, it's probably not the best thing for me to close on, but I think there is real value in entering into these things sober and really understanding what the limitations of these opportunities and programs can be, while at the same time aspiring to the opportunities. One of the first things I wrote down when I was listening to you, Anne, was there is this inherent tension between incrementalism and complete transformative optimism. And you need to have some of both, really. And we need to figure out how we do that in an effective way so that people don't get discouraged, so that people don't give up, and that we don't leave places actually in worse condition than when we started. And we have lots of examples of having done that the wrong way. I think that the types of projects that you guys studied in the book give us a host of rich examples of information that we should know to make sure that doesn't happen as we move forward. And so I would thank you again for doing this. I had no hand in funding it or anything like that, but I do think that it does give us a lot of information that will, as we read it and reread it and reread it, even learn new lessons that will help us be more effective in these things.
And especially talk it through, as opposed to just reading it, I think, and applying it to specific contexts. And do you want to say anything before we close? We still have half an hour of food and visits.
No, I just want to thank everybody very much for coming tonight. I really appreciate you all being here. We've learned so much from all of you. I think that what Zab said about how the conversation now is so much crisper than it was 10 years ago is really, really on point. And it's because of all of the work that all of you have done that is so fantastic on the ground, and how you keep learning and sharing with us as you go along. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.